I'm reading from the book, The Flat Earth as Key to Decrypt the Book of Enoch by Zen Garcia. Chapter 3, The Ancient Hebrew Calendar. I will in the following chapters relate how the flat earth as model for the world ties in with not only the book of the courses of the heavenly luminaries, but also with the ancient Hebrew calendar system. This study enables one to determine when new moon day occurs according to Enoch, which in turn assists one in making sense of God's calendar system. The determination of new moon is key for unlocking each of the lunar months of this calendar system, as the remaining days and weeks align to this one particular day and phase of the moon. This information will also demonstrate how many mainstream Christians are currently involved in a form of worship which, marrying paganism to traditional Hebrew faith, created a religious amalgamation called, quote, Christianity, which has many of them unwittingly involved in worship of pagan deities and holidays, which the Most High considers a form of idolatry. This deception has many regularly breaking these two commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Exodus 20, verses 3 and 8. The Most High knew that the ancient calendar system which he had given to his people would both be altered and then lost, and that the adherence of the above two commandments would no longer be possible once this happened. He also foresaw how such an occurrence would enable Satan to further lead easily astray his people, involving them unknowingly in other forms of idolatry which could detrimentally affect their eternal inheritance. Knowing all these things, he would, at the end of days, lead the reemergence of truth in a way that would restore awareness of his calendar to those that sought understanding of it. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Daniel 7:25. And command thou the children of Israel that they observe the years according to this reckoning, 364 days, and these will constitute a complete year, and they will not disturb its time from its days and from its feasts, for everything will fall out in them according to their testimony, and they will not leave out any day, nor disturb any feast. But if they do neglect, and do not observe them according to his commandment, then they will disturb all their seasons, and the years will be dislodged from this order, and they will disturb the seasons, and the years will be dislodged, and they will neglect their ordinances. And all the children of Israel will forget, and will not find the path of the years, and will forget the new moons, and seasons, and Sabbaths, and they will go wrong as to all the order of the years. For I know, and from henceforth will I declare it unto thee, and it is not of my own devising, for the book lies written before me, and on the heavenly tablets the division of days is ordained, lest they forget the feasts of the covenant, and walk according to the feasts of the Gentiles after their error and after their ignorance. For there will be those who will assuredly make observations of the moon, how it disturbs the seasons, and comes in from year to year, 10 days too soon. For this reason, the years will come upon them when they will disturb the order and make an abominable day, the day of testimony, and an unclean day a feast day, and they will confound all the days, the holy with the unclean, and the unclean day with the holy, for they will go wrong as to the months, and Sabbaths, and feasts, and jubilees. For this reason I command and testify to thee, that thou mayest testify to them. For after thy death thy children will disturb them, so that they will not make the year 364 days only. And for this reason they will go wrong as to the new moons, and seasons, and Sabbaths, and festivals, and they will eat all kinds of blood with all kinds of flesh. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 6, verses 32 through 38. These passages illustrate how the Most High had foreseen that the calendar system would be changed, and how Sabbath, instead of being determined by new moon, would be associated with a specific day of the week, Sunday, and in this way would confound observance of the Levitical holy days. According to the Gregorian calendar, for modern Jews, Sabbath occurs every Friday at sunset to every Saturday sunset. For Seventh-day Adventists, Sabbath occurs every Saturday. And for modern Christians, Sabbath occurs every Sunday. Would it surprise you to know that according to the ancient Hebrew calendar, all of them are wrong? In the next chapter, I will explain why they are wrong, how the Most High's lunar-based calendar system differs from the Julian, Gregorian, solar-based calendar system, and why determining Sabbath by them is impossible, as well as why such determination, if one wants to be correct, can only be made using God's lunar-based system. Chapter 4. God's Calendar Explained. Knowing the end from the beginning, the Most High knew that the Roman emperors, Pharisee leadership, and the Catholic Church, under the guidance of Satan, would all work in accord to denigrate use of the ancient Hebrew calendar, disrupting the mandated adherence of the holy days celebrated by the Israelites. And because most do not understand the history connected to the implementation of the Julian and then later Gregorian solar-based calendar systems, or how Sabbath was affixed to a particular day of the week, few people truly understand how the observance of the Sabbath was compromised, or how this disrupted the timing of the Levitical feast days. Pressure to abandon the ancient Hebrew lunar-based calendar, enforcing the rapid assimilation of the Julian solar-based calendar, was so severe during the ancient Roman times, those who resisted its implementation were tortured to death as a way to set precedents for the change. But even under the threat of such severe punishment looming over them, many refused to comply because the days of the week on the Julian calendar had been named after pagan deities, making their observation of it idolatrous. Many chose to suffer death rather than adhere. Eventually, though, the struggle against its forced implementation faded as its use spread wide with the extension of the Roman Empire. The most die-hard holdouts were slaughtered, the rest conceded, and by the 4th century AD, even the Jews accepted the observance of Sabbath to an affixed day of the week, forever confounding the regulation of time as relegated by the Most High's calendar system. The role Mithraism played in restructuring the Julian week is significant, for it was a strong competitor of early Christianity. It seems as if some spiritual genius, having control over the pagan world, had so ordered things that the heathen planetary week should be introduced just at the right time for the most popular sun cult of all ages to come along and exalt the day of the sun as a day above and more sacred than all the rest. Surely this was not accidental. Under these two factors, the Julian week began a centuries-long evolutionary process that ended in the week as it is known today. The original 7-day planetary week is the third and final piece of the puzzle, proving that Saturday is not the scriptural Sabbath, nor Sunday, the first day of the Hebrew week. This transformation took several hundred years. Franz Cumont, widely considered to be a great authority on Mithraism, links the acceptance of the 7-day week by Europeans to the popularity of Mithraism in pagan Rome. It is not to be doubted that the diffusion of the Iranian-Persian mysteries has had a considerable part in the general adoption by the pagans of the week with the Sunday as a holy day. The names which we employ for the other 6 days came into use at the same time that Mithraism won its followers in the provinces in the West, and one is not rash in establishing a relation of coincidence between its triumph and that concomitant phenomenon. In his book Astrology and Religion Among the Greeks and Romans, Cumont further emphasizes the pagan origins and recent adoption of a 7-day week with its holy day being Sunday. The preeminence assigned to the day of the sun also certainly contributed to the general recognition of Sunday as a holiday. This is connected with a more important fact, namely the adoption of the week by all the European nations. Franz Cumont, Astrology and Religion Among the Greeks and Romans. The fact that Christians had accepted both the Julian calendar and the pagan planetary gods' week for use reveals the beginnings of an amalgamation of Christianity with paganism. The pagan planetary gods' week, like the Julian calendar that adopted it, is irreparably pagan. Historical facts reveal that neither the scriptural Hebrew Sabbath nor the scriptural first day can be found using the modern calendar. If it is important to worship on a specific day, then it is also important to know which calendar to use and when the change in calendation occurred. Christopher Tyerman, The Destruction of Sabbath. The confusion surrounding Sabbath was one of the reasons why the Essenes, writers and collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, separating themselves, compiled elaborate tables in effort to align both calendar systems together. As followers of Yahweh, they were trying to keep track of time according to the new solar-based system, so that as a community they could maintain adherence to the Levitical holy days. It is also postulated that the reason they held the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees in high regard is because both of these texts had incorporated within them great elaboration on how God's calendar system works. This may also have contributed to why they were eradicated from the authorized canon by the forces put into place by Satan to prevent the continuation of such knowledge. I believe the Council of Nicaea was more about hiding the truth and keeping it from the masses than it was about preserving it for compilation and later dissemination. The belief that Saturday must be the Sabbath of the Bible because the Jews worship on that day is an assumption that all Christians have made. However, in light of the fact that the Jews themselves admit that their modern calendar is not the same as that used before the 4th century Common Era, Bible scholars and all who love the Sabbath would do well to re-examine this long-held belief. If it is important to worship on a precise, specific day, then the calendar by which you calculate that day must also be the correct calendar. The lunar solar calendar is the only calendar which has roots in the Bible. It was established by God at creation. All other calendars have roots in paganism. To truly keep the 4th commandment, the Sabbath should be calculated by God's calendar, the moon. There are 4 main areas in which the original calendar differs from the replacement. Number 1. The original scriptural lunar calendar uses only the lunar cycle and the ripening barley harvest to set weeks, months, and years. Number 2. The Julian Gregorian replacements, being solar calendars, honor the sun god. Designed to begin the year just after the, quote, rebirth of the sun god at the winter solstice. The scriptural Hebrew lunar calendar in no way attaches itself to a time recognizing another god. Number 3. The Julian Gregorian calendars have a continuous weekly cycle of Sunday through Saturday. The original calendar established in the Hebrew text at the beginning does not. Some months carry an extra day between the last Sabbath of the month and the Sabbath to begin the months. The weekly cycle restarts with each new moon month. Number 4. The modern lunisolar calendar has each Friday night as Sabbath and fails to observe the instructions for a Sabbath at the sighting of the new moon which begins each Hebrew month as the original scripture-based Hebrew lunar calendar commanded. Christopher Tyerman, The Destruction of the Sabbath. God's calendar system is based in every way on the characteristics of the moon during its 4 quarterly phases. Every month commences with the sighting of the new moon, referred to as Kodesh, which in Hebrew means the time of the new moon. In this system, Kodesh is always counted as the first day and Sabbath of each new lunar month. In ancient times, it was the duty of the high priest, along with 2 or 3 witnesses, to determine when this phase of the moon had occurred, since this determination set the fixed orientation of the following 4 Sabbath weeks. Every month contains 5 Sabbaths, beginning with Kodesh and ending with lunar conjunction, or what is also known as the dark moon. And even though the new moon is designated as the first day of the month, it is never counted as part of the 7-day weeks of the following 4 Sabbaths. I will explain this more below, but first, let me explain what the new moon day is and how it is determined, since there is some confusion surrounding its definition. The new moon day, according to the ancient Hebrew calendar, is different from what science has designated to be new moon. According to science, new moon aligns with what God's calendar refers to as lunar conjunction, or the dark moon, which is the last phase of the moon and day according to his system instead of the first. Conjunction, defined as a noun, is an action or instance which unites the occurrence of 2 or more events or things to the same point in time or space. Lunar conjunction is therefore defined as the phase of the moon which, aligned with the sun, accompanies it in circuit rising as it rises, moving across the sky as it does, and then setting as it sets. In astronomy, new moon is the first phase of the moon when it orbits as seen from the Earth, the moment when the moon and the sun have the same elliptical longitude. The moon is not visible at this time except when it is seen in silhouette during a solar eclipse, when it is illuminated by earthshine. It's from Wikipedia. According to Wikipedia and science, new moon aligns with the dark moon, which again is the last phase of the moon cycle according to God's calendar instead of the first. Be aware of this differentiation as we commence the discussion of how God's calendar system works in depth, since this distinction will be absolutely critical in regard to the determination of Kodesh. There is one other aspect surrounding the timing of the Kodesh which also causes confusion in regard to its determination, and so I thought this would be an appropriate place to begin commentary on it. Even though the moon will for a short time first become visible as a very thin waxing crescent called a, quote, young moon following sunset at the very end of lunar conjunction, this sighting of it is not regarded as Kodesh by Enoch, or God's calendar. Enoch specifies in 72 verse 9 and 77 verse 5 that what the Most High considers to be Kodesh is a waxing crescent which, shining by at least a, quote, half of a seventh portion of light, is at least 0.071428571428714% full. This particular phase of the moon usually occurs and can be seen anywhere from 24 to 48 hours after lunar conjunction. On these days, it trails behind sunrise by 1 to several hours, and moving across the sky during the day becomes clearly visible in western skies when the sun sets and the sky darkens. In Israel, during ancient times, trained observers assigned task of watching for Kodesh would, upon witnessing it, go before the Sanhedrin Council to declare its arrival before the high priest. The high priest would then authorize the announcement of it to the rest of the nation, whereby the shofar, a trumpet made out of ram's horn, was sounded throughout the land far and wide, informing the Hebrew people of the commencement of the festivities linked to the new moon Sabbath. Being a special day unto God, the Israelites always tithed more in a way donation to the temple during Kodesh than they did for any of the following 4 Sabbaths. And on your joyous occasions, your fixed festivals and new moon days, you shall sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and your sacrifices of well-being. Numbers chapter 10, verse 10. There are 2 major differences between how God structured his lunar-based calendar system and that the Julian and Gregorian solar-based calendar systems is, number 1, in God's calendar system, Kodesh is excluded from the 7-day counts of the following 4 Sabbath weeks. And number 2, the months, because they are aligned to the 4 phases of the moon, are never longer than 30 days. The format for his calendar is laid out as follows. Workday Sabbath. New Moon Day, 1st. 6 workdays, dates 2nd through 7th. Sabbath, 8th. 6 workdays, dates 9th through 14th. Sabbath, 15th. 6 workdays, dates 16th through 21st, Sabbath 22nd. 6 workdays, dates 23rd through 28th, Sabbath 29th. Translation date 30th when needed. In modern calendar format, every Hebrew month appears thus. The 30th of the month, like the 1st of the month, was not part of the weekly cycle, simply a placeholder to await the adjustment of the lunar cycle. However, it was counted and did have a date, as an account must be made of all time. The original scriptural Hebrew lunar calendar has a periodically added month instead of just a leap day. A solar year of 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes, and 12 seconds is longer than a lunar year by 10 days, 21 hours, and 6.72 minutes. As this extra time accrues, every 2 to 3 years, a 13th month is required to be added to adjust the Hebrew calendar back to the seasons. The instructions are for determining whether an additional month was needed is simple. If the barley crop is ripe enough to harvest in the 11th month, then the 12th month was the end of the year. If the crops were not ready in the 12th month, then a 13th month was added as a, quote, leap month in that year. This adjusted the lunar calendar back in line with the solar year. Many seem to have trouble with the idea that the system could be that simple. Christopher Tyerman, The Destruction of Sabbath. Another very interesting correlation between God's calendar and the moon is the way that the 5 monthly Sabbaths align to the cycle of its quarterly phases, adding to the measure of time, a visual component not present in the solar calendar systems. Chodesh, as new moon, is always marked by the first Sabbath and day of the new lunar month. It is followed by 6 working days, and then the second Sabbath, which always somewhat aligns with the first quarter moon. The second Sabbath is then followed by 6 more working days, leading up to the third Sabbath, which always somewhat aligns with the full moon, occurring 14 days after the first Sabbath. The third Sabbath is then followed by 6 more working days, leading up to the fourth Sabbath, which always somewhat aligns with the third quarter moon, occurring 21 days after the first Sabbath. The fourth Sabbath is then followed by 6 more working days, leading up to the fifth and final Sabbath, which always somewhat aligns with lunar conjunction as the last 29th or 30th day of the month, alternatively occurring either 28 or 29 days after the first Sabbath. Every month of this calendar system begins with a Sabbath and ends with a Sabbath, and correspondingly, all 5 Sabbaths together always fall upon similarly the 1st, 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th or 30th day, depending on lunar conjunction. This pattern repeats in exactly the same manner for every one of the 12 lunar months which comprise the year on God's calendar. When one studies the ancient calendar systems which were in use across the world, even in Rome, most of them had been predominantly aligned to the moon's cyclical phases and only deviated from such emphasis much later in history, being replaced by systems which revered the sun and were based upon its annual cycle. The one main difference differentiating the measure of time between the Most High's lunar-based calendar from that of the Julian, Gregorian, solar-based systems is the exclusion of Chodesh from the count of the other 7 days comprising the 4 weeks of the month. This exclusion is what makes determining when Sabbath occurs impossible on the newer Roman and papal systems, since all 7 days of every week of every month of these systems are all strung together in continuous fashion with no regard for the new moon Sabbath. Their months also vary in length without congruency, February being shorter, 28 days, and other months longer, 31 days. and because there is no order or pattern to the indeterminate lengths of each of the months of the solar calendar year, both new moon Sabbath and the weekly Sabbath can occur on any of the days of the week, depending upon how the months come together. And whereas they might occur on a Monday of one particular month, they could very well fall on a Friday the next month, and possibly Tuesday the following one. This is why mainstream Christianity's gathering for church service on Sunday as a way to honor Sabbath has but 1 in 7 chance of being right on any given month. And even though sometimes their observance of it does randomly occur on the correct day, the percentages are such that they will mostly be wrong throughout the year. The same applies to the Seventh-day Adventists' observance of it on Saturday, as well as Jewish observance of it from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. As group, none of them has greater than 1 in 7 chance of being right on any given month throughout the year, which is why none of these time frame observances has any true affiliation with Sabbath as determined by God's calendar, and why it could fall on any day of the week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or any other. This is also why those that keep track of time utilizing the Julian or Gregorian solar-based systems can never truly know when the new moon Sabbath or weekly Sabbaths occur. The only exception to this rule are those that monitor time utilizing print or online calendars, which include symbolic markers depicting the moon's quarterly phases. But even then, one must be aware that these pictorial symbols are based upon scientific definitions for the moon's lunar phases and not God's. This distinction aligns new moon with lunar conjunction and not a 7% waxing crescent, which throws off the occurrence of Kudesh by 12 to 36 hours or so. As long as one can understand why this contrast is important and adjust calculation accordingly, one should have no problem with distinguishing how the lunar phases coordinate with the 5 Sabbaths of each month as delineated by God's calendar. Most Torah-observant Jews, modern-day Christians, and even Seventh-day Adventists have little, if any, realization that there exists rampant confusion surrounding the observance of Sabbath, as most have never even heard about the ancient Hebraic calendar system, let alone understand how the intricacies of such system align to the determination of Sabbath. What few Jews, and even less Sabbatarians, know is during the AD 4th century, persecution of all who used the original Hebrew lunar-based calendar for worship was so intense that in the end, the Jews gave up their calendar handed down from the text of the creation through to Moses, and instead adopted a calendar adjusted for worship based on the solar-centered Julian calendar. If asked, the Jewish leadership is very open that their original calendar was set aside under the intense Roman persecution of all who used the Hebrew calendar in the AD 4th century, under the reign of Constantius, 337 through 362, the persecutions of the Jews reached such a height that the computation of the calendar was forbidden under pain of severe punishment. The new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was dependent upon the lunar cycle. Originally, the new moon was celebrated in the same way as the Sabbath. Gradually, it became less important, while the Sabbath became more and more a day of religion and humanity, of religious meditation and instruction, of peace and delight of the soul. From Holidays, Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, page 410. With the development of the importance of the Sabbath as a day of consecration and the emphasis laid upon the significant number 7, the week became more and more divorced from its lunar connection. From Week, Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, Yitzhak Landman, editor, Volume 10, 1943 edition, page 482. It is easy to see how such a tradition could be used to justify changing the calendar due to the extreme persecution facing all who worshipped by the lunar-based Hebrew calendar. Using his authority as president of the Sanhedrin, it is assumed that Hillel, too, tied the annual feasts to the spring equinox. Next, he adjusted the weekly seventh-day Sabbath to the Julian seventh-day Saturday. This, quote, freed the Jews from the condemnation of the law, since they no longer knew when the true Sabbath occurred. Thus, they justified their use of the pagan calendar. Christopher Tyerman, The Destruction of Sabbath. True Sabbath is aligned to Kodesh and can only be determined by its occurrence. But because the months of the Gregorian solar-based calendar have been relinquished from ties to the natural cycle of the moon's quarterly phases, Sabbath can fall on any day of the week: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. And since most of the people alive today follow the Gregorian solar calendar, do not pay attention to the phases of the moon, and do not understand how God's calendar divides the lunar months of the year, they do not, as consequence, know when to celebrate Sabbath, since they never actually know when it occurs. In order to better enable you as reader capacity to grasp what I have been alluding to over the last few paragraphs, one can analyze the idiosyncrasies of this system to this calendar image. Study of it should enable one to gain greater insight into how the system works in relation to Kodesh. As a visual representation, it should better enable one to perceive the simplicity of God's calendar design. Because observance of God's lunar-based calendar was punishable by death, its replacement was assured by the widespread implementation of the Julian solar-based calendar, which accompanied the expansion of the Roman Empire in 46 BC. This brought forth another aspect of Satan's plan: the obscurity of the Most High's holy days and bewilderment of his people. For those who use the scriptural Hebrew calendar, calculation is very simple. The weekdays, the Sabbath, and new moon Sabbath of each lunar month always fall on the exact same dates of each Hebrew month. This explains why, whenever the date of a seventh-day Sabbath is given in the Hebrew scripture, it always falls on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, or 29th of the Hebrew month. The days of the week do not float through the monthly dates as they do now on the modern Gregorian calendar. After Hillel II, quote, fixed the calendar to fit into a Julian framework and moved the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath from the lunar week to the continuously cycling Julian week, difficulties arose. The new moon would cycle through the Julian days of the week, which caused the annual feast to fall on the wrong times of the month. As a result, rules of postponement were established, something that was unnecessary with the scriptural Hebrew calendar became necessary with the inefficient and ever-changing Julian solar calendar. Those who desire to worship on the true seventh-day Sabbath should not look to modern calendation efforts. All who worship on Saturday because, quote, the Jews keep Saturday, are not following the scriptural Hebrew Sabbath, but the false Sabbath that Hillel II's corruption of the original calendation fashioned. This corruption of the correct day thus channeled the whole of the Jewish people into breaking one of the Hebrew Scripture's most important decrees and caused them to lose track of the new moon Sabbath of each month. From The Destruction of Sabbath. Even the Jews, which most believe are the current embodiment of God's chosen people Israel, do not follow the calendar which was passed down to them from and through the Old Testament patriarchs. Their deviation from the calendar of their Hebraic forefathers occurred in the 4th century AD as a result of the persecution levied against anyone attempting to adhere to the ancient Hebraic system. This disruption and replacement of God's calendar then ushered in an age which brought with it, first, the corruption of the traditional Levitical feasts and festival days, 2, the pagan malfeasance of the budding new Christian church established by the outreach of the apostles of Christ, and 3, the rise to power of Constantine the Great, which through legitimizing the Christian faith enhanced its pagan origins. The son of Flavius Valerius Constantius, a Roman army officer, and his consort Helena. His father became Caesar, the deputy emperor in the West in 293 AD. Constantine was sent east, where he rose through the ranks to become a military tribune under the emperors Diocletian and Galerius. In 305, Constantius was raised to the rank of Augustus, senior Western emperor, and Constantine was recalled west to campaign under his father in Britannia. Acclaimed as emperor by the army at Eboracum, modern-day York, after his father's death in 306 AD, Constantine emerged victorious in a series of civil wars against the emperors Maxentius and Licinius to become sole ruler of both West and East by 324 AD, from Wikipedia. Considered to be the first Christian emperor, Constantine became the sole monarch of the Western Roman Empire following victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. Recounting the success of this campaign in journal, Constantine wrote that preceding this battle, while looking up at the sun, he saw the vision of a cross of light with words emblazoned in Greek, meaning, "In this sign conquer." Because of this, Constantine attributed his achievement to, quote, "the protection of the high God of the Christians." This result spurred his decision to stop the oppression of them throughout the extent of Western Roman Empire. With the issuance of the Edict of Milan in 312 AD, this became official policy ending the criminalization and persecution of Christian worship and extending to all Roman citizens the liberty to worship as one chose, establishing with it the tolerance of all religions. And while this was seen as a great triumph for Christians of that era, it consolidated as dates of worship those deemed acceptable for the celebratory observance of the two largest groups of people making up the demographic of Rome, Christians and pagans. And while the persecution of Christians ended with the Edict of Milan, Christianity as faith was usurped by this newly organized, quote, religious system. Those that later joined its ranks were quickly indoctrinated into the acceptance of not only the measure of time according to the Julian solar calendar, but into the reverence of paganized, quote, holidays, which I believe can be categorized as a form of idolatry. This ends the reading of chapters 3 and 4 from The Flat Earth as Key to Decrypt the Book of Enoch by Zen Garcia. I now wish to read a small portion of an article entitled M. L. Andreasen, The Reason Why SDAs Keep Saturday Instead of the Lunar Sabbath. Back in 1938, General Conference President James Lamar McElhenney appointed a research committee to study the basis on which the Millerites arrived at October 22, 1844 date. A high-ranking member of this committee was M. L. Andreasen. After careful study of the Millerite methodology and the biblical calendar, an entirely unexpected and unwelcomed discovery was made. When the Sabbath is calculated by the biblical calendar, it does not fall on Saturday. They came across another shocking revelation. Although Scripture makes clear that Yahushua was crucified on Passover, the sixth day of the week, the Passover did not fall on Friday in AD 31. The research committee faced a clear dilemma. If AD 31 is rejected as the crucifixion year, then the 2,300-day prophecy did not begin in 457 BC, and thus did not end in 1844. And the weekly cycle of the biblical calendar does not correspond to the weekly cycle of the modern calendar, because there is no way possible for Yahushua to have been crucified on a Friday in AD 31, even though he was crucified on the 6th day of the biblical week. The committee was at a loss to know what to do with their two startling findings. They studied the ramifications of presenting the biblical calendar to the church. Tragically, instead of running to the church with the news that Saturday is not the biblical Sabbath, the committee took the opposite action. They began to search for reasons why their discoveries needed to be kept hidden from the members of the church. Andreasen provided the reasons and the rationale why the committee needed to hush this truth from the members. Here are the reasons he gave. Quote, "It would not be easy to explain to the people that the God who advocated and instituted such an arrangement would be very concerned about the exact seventh day. Quote, if an explanation were possible, and the people were at last adjusted to the shift in the feast day and the stability of the seventh day, it might be supposed that in time they would get used to the arrangement. But they would no sooner have become accustomed to this till another shift is made. Now they shift back to where they were before." Quote, "But neither is this settled or stationary. Another shift comes, and another, and another. Now Denver observes the day before Omaha does. Then it observes the same day. Now Omaha and Chicago observe the same day, but at another time a different day. There is no uniformity, and just as the people get used to a certain arrangement, the day is changed again. Such is more than the common people can understand. And if we go to the people now with such a proposition, we must expect that confusion will result. And our enemies will not be slow to point out the difficulties and ring the changes on them." Those quotes were from M.L. Andreasen, Undated Letter to Grace Amadon, Grace Amadon Collection, Box 2, Folder 4, Center. The abominable reasons and rationale that Andreasen provided the committee so they would not share with the church their findings resulted in the tragic outcome of the SDA Church continuing to keep Saturday as the Sabbath. Yahuwah tried to show this committee that there is a divine calendar by which the Sabbath and his feasts are to be determined, and that it was not acceptable to him that his people continue to keep the Sabbath by Rome's calendar. This divine light was hushed by the committee, and Andreasen provided the justification for hiding this precious light from the members of the SDA Church, and thus from the whole world. It is tragic when someone turns his or her back on Yahuwah's truth, but it is infinitely more tragic when someone uses his or her elevated standing in the eyes of others to obstruct heaven's light from Yahuwah's faithful. We tremble for the fate of Andreasen and many other leaders within the SDA Church who have stood as a barrier between Yahuwah and his people.